Well, friends, this morning in these chapters, we're thinking of the returning king. King David has been on the run, but he is now returning. And there's something really disarmingly human about these two chapters that we're in today. We read about a grieving father, a broken nation, a fragile peace that doesn't really last from within the nation. And so right in the middle of all of this, though, it's meant to be good news. David, the promised king, according to God's covenant of Israel, is now getting back to Jerusalem. The enemy, in this case his son Absalom, has been defeated. So this is really confusing because you think that you're at this point in a story where there's some celebration. You know, the crisis seems to be over, but as we read these chapters, we can realize something quite quickly as we see the disorder and everything else that's going on, that the greatest threats to God's people, they're not always on the outside, they're on the inside. Division, pride, misplaced priorities, unresolved conflict. So these chapters don't just show us about the mess of God's people in the Old Covenant in God's kingdom. They remind us, as Paul instructs us how to read these passages as the church today, they remind us that we are exposed to the same struggles in our church today at times. But also, more importantly, they keep pointing us to a better king, because actually, as you keep reading about David's kingdom, I know for most of us, maybe we draw on Goliath, maybe we draw on his winning these battles, but actually when we're going through 1 and 2 Samuel bit by bit, we see that it is a really difficult situation and a disappointing king that we find in David, pointing to a better king. So first of all, as we think about this morning, we see faithfulness always must trump emotion. In other words, faithfulness to God must take priority over our emotions. As we read in verses 1 to 8, David is still weeping over Absalom. We read it at the end of chapter 18, and now we're reading it again in chapter 19. Oh, my son Absalom. These are shouts of anguish and grief. My son Absalom. This is not exaggerated mourning. This is not some kind of performance mourning. It's the cry of David's broken heart as a broken father. But the problem is, while King David grieves, his people suffer. The soldiers who risk their lives to save him are returning to Jerusalem in a celebratory way? No. We read that they're coming back quietly, and I can't help but remember all those years ago, the Vietnam War, and one of the worst things that the soldiers experienced in the Vietnam War were not the booby traps, were not the Viet Cong trying to blow them up at night and all the rest of it. Their hardest experience was when, after doing their tours of duty, they'd fly into the States and suddenly notice a lot of people with flowers screaming and cursing at them because of their involvement in that war. It's similar, the dynamic here, because of David's grief. They're going back into Jerusalem as troops, quietly, as if they had lost, not won. And it's because their king is focused on his son, their enemy and his enemy, Absalom. And so General Joab, from verse 5 to verse 7, he confronts David. Today, he says, you've humiliated all of your men. That's a bit harsh, isn't it, to somebody grieving? But it's nonetheless true. You see, David's public grief as a leader of his men is now hurting his loyal people. And so David rises, as you see in verse 8, and he takes his seat at the gate, this significant seat of leadership, to receive his people. And he does what is right. He receives his people as their king again. But here's the challenge for us as the Lord's people today. Grief and any other kind of emotion, anger, hilarity, whatever it is, they're all part of the human experience, aren't they? They're not wrong. It's what makes us human. But here's the thing, unchecked emotions in our lives that begin to rule us, it's not helpful. And in this case, grief can become so self-absorbed to the point that they can lead us away from our call to be faithful to Christ. And so leaders here, whether you're a parent at home, yes, you're a leader. Whether you're doing various ministries in this church that you feel responsible for, yes, you're a leader. Whether you're involved in leading the church, we are called to lead our people more than being led by our emotions. We know that Jesus wept, didn't he? We know that he grieved over the death of Lazarus before he miraculously brought him to life. We know that Jesus wept over Jerusalem, but his emotions never diverted him from his call, from his mission. And so when David was ruled by his emotions, he was undermining God's calling on his life over God's people. Therefore, it's important how we understand the place of our emotions in our lives, not denying them, not getting them out at times, but not letting them be the way that we lead. You see, for the church, this really matters. Because if we allow our emotions to rule us, we won't remain faithful to Christ. We could fall into sin, and we won't be faithful to those that we walk alongside in the church to serve Christ. It's especially the case for Christian leaders. We must be careful not to allow our emotional lives cause us to lash out or to withdraw like David did. Imagine, if you will, your pastor being emotional all the time. providing an emotional reaction to everything that's said to me in the week and on Sunday mornings before the service when I'm trying to get ready for the service. I have to keep a control of my emotions, otherwise it compromises the leadership of the church. But that's not just the case for the pastor, that's the case for the Christian at home and in the various ministries that God has called you to. We must be careful not to be ruled by our emotions. And this church family, with all of its difficult times, mustn't let our emotions cause us then to lash out or to isolate ourselves from each other. Yes, we might have serious grievances over things of the past and indeed of the present. But we're still here, our priority is to worship him. And yes, we might feel emotionally drained because things aren't right or we're not happy about a situation, but we are called to keep following him with others in a gathered church. Why? Because we follow a king who was emotional as well, but who remained faithful to his call. And so with our faithfulness to him, we don't lose sight of our purpose in him. We are careful that we don't let emotions rule over the way we are as people, because we want to remain faithful to Christ and his call in our lives. That's what that ancient example of emotions overtaking a leader teaches. But as we go on in chapter 19, we also see this problem of Sheba, this rebel, and his pride bringing about division, because as David now is in the process of returning to Jerusalem with this kind of victory march, and his own family tribe, Judah, wanting to escort him in, the people, yes, they begin to welcome him back. And at first it looked like this solid restoration of the nation under King David, but quickly Division, before David has even got back to Jerusalem, is rearing its ugly head. Have a look with me in 15, verse 15b. Now the men of Judah had come to Gilgal to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. This was his family tribe, the tribe of Judah that brought David back across the Jordan. But the other tribes of Israel were getting annoyed. And we see the offense in what we read in verses 41 to 43 of chapter 19. And you see that to and fro in verses 41 to 43. The Israelite tribes are accusing the Judean tribe of taking advantage, the priority of them taking David back in. They defend themselves. And then we get to that last verse of chapter 19. It says, but the men of Judah responded even more harshly than the men of Israel. There is a fight. There is division. And David isn't even back in Jerusalem. Judah are responding defensively to the other tribes, and the other tribes were annoyed with the actions of Judah, resulting in this ugly last line in chapter 19. Lots of fighting, lots of accusation flying. And just like that, even with David being reinstalled as king of Israel, the unity of the kingdom is beginning to crack again. But why did Israel, this ancient church of God, start squabbling? Well, it wasn't for theological reasons. It wasn't because truth was at stake. They were fighting over human experience, human fallen experience, injured pride, a lack of recognition, feeling like they were being ignored. And of course, once again, this teaching then is for the church today, because churches rarely divide over matters of Christian doctrine alone. Commonly, the issue in a church may be about Christian doctrine, but when you begin to dig under the surface, you also understand that people have been angry with each other maybe for a number of years, and they dress up their differences with the use of doctrine to fall out. You see, churches commonly fall out with each other, really, in the same way as we read in 2 Samuel 19, and especially towards the end. It's an issue of hurt, an issue of hurt pride, perhaps, a lack of recognition, a frustration of not having enough of one's attention or way on an issue, hurt feelings, unspoken rivalry. And sadly, you see, when these desires within us are not met in the church and frustration and anger prevails, we forget verses in the New Testament that are very clearly warning us against this bubbling up. Ephesians 4 verse 3 says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Why do you think Paul instructs the ancient believers in the ancient local churches to make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace? Well, otherwise division happens because we're human beings. But Jesus, the true King, we know that he did not demand honor for himself, did he? He laid his honor down for your sake and mine. He washed feet. He welcomed the overlooked and despised. He took the insults and the threats and the hurts. He humbled himself then to the point of death. And through his humility, he creates a body of unity in this dark world called the church. So with our tendencies, even in the church, to fight and to fall out as humans, how does our church remain unified and able to flourish and grow with sinners, yes we are, saved by grace? Simple. We're to pursue Christ as individuals. We're to read about him. We're to model the head of our church, Jesus Christ. And if we even begin to scrape the surface of who Jesus is, we know that he is humility. He is humility personified, not entitlement, not wanting to get one's way to the point of falling out with others. We need humility as we see his humility bought us back from sin and death. We need to care about his mission more than anything else, more than personal recognition, more than having our way, more than being willing to fall out over our opinions. We need to be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to take offense, because if our church is to grow, spiritually first and numerically, we are meant to be reflectors of who Jesus is and not who we are. And that means rejecting pride at every level. Because now, as we go into our next section, we see what unchecked, divisive pride results in chapter 20 we're now in. Because immediately following on from that fight between the tribe of Judah and the other Jews about who's bringing King David into Jerusalem, we've got a troublemaker. See the beginning of chapter 20. Along comes Sheba, and obviously this is not the queen of Sheba, this is another Sheba, son of Bichri. And he is addressed immediately from the outset as a no good doer, a troublemaker. And he blows on a trumpet and he shouts, "We have no portion in David, every man to his tent." You see how he feeds into the division and makes a pronouncement. This is what we do in the face of the division. And suddenly the disgruntled tribes just follow him back to their home areas, back to their tents. And just think about that for a moment. Remember the setting. After David's restoration as king of Israel, after the victory, it just takes one big mouth to divide God's people again. And of course, that's the nature of sin, isn't it? It spreads quickly. It appeals to human emotions, maybe emotions that haven't been dealt with before the Lord. And before long, what was a disagreement between Judah and the other tribes concerning who would escort David into Jerusalem now becomes this full-on rebellion. And David hasn't even got to Jerusalem yet. And we must take this seriously, because remember what the Apostle Paul writes to the church concerning the Old Testament. In 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 6, we read, "These things like this that we're reading, occurred as examples to keep us, the church, those who are saved by Christ today, in our churches, from setting our hearts on evil things as they did." Unresolved tension, pride, a quiet distance, open division. Friends, all of this leads to the destruction of a church. And it's happened again and again and again over time, over history, and it's very sad, because it ends up being a bad witness to those around us to the gospel of Jesus. And so with this rebellion of Sheba, David, he responds very quickly. See in verse 4, he sends his nephew commander Amasa to go and sort out this rebel Sheba. But Amasa delays, and so maybe in some kind of rivalry and an annoyance, General Joab, he takes over the pursuit of Sheba. But then in this brutal act, he kills Amasa with a dagger. And we're seeing now that with all of this mess of division, with David not even in the palace yet, David's army is a mess. It's broken. They're murdering each other in the high ranks. And it teaches us that human leadership at its best is completely flawed. And that's why we need Christ. In this church, we may say that we're Christians, we may say that we know Jesus, but he must be central to all that we are, how we live, how we behave, and how we are with each other, because Jesus' kingdom is different to David's kingdom. He transforms people like us. He doesn't just stop with dealing with division. He creates a new people. If we're professing faith in Jesus today, we are a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come. He has, as we read earlier in Ephesians, he has broken down the dividing wall of hostility. So for us as a church in him, we need to deal with division. It's a natural byproduct of being human. But we must deal with it, and we must deal with it early, and we can pray about the causes of disunity in our church, and we can remember that this whole subject of Christian unity is a spiritual work. It starts here. It starts in my heart. It starts in your heart. It starts with confronting those things, those offenses, those annoyances that you may have with other people in this church, and that you bring that to the Lord and you ask him through his Spirit to cause those hurts and those annoyances to go away. It has to start there. Because the church is not immune to division. But hallelujah, we can overcome division through Jesus Christ, through his love, through his grace fresh to us every morning. He will allow us as a church miraculously to flourish despite the ongoing possibility of divisiveness. Last bit, verses 14 to 21, we see now wisdom's preservation. I want to say the titles again because I enjoy putting them together. Okay. Faithfulness trumps emotion. We need to be careful as leaders, whatever capacity you're a leader as a Christian, that you don't be driven just by your emotions. You're going to get into a heap of trouble if you do. Pride brings division. Remember Sheba? He steps up on this fight at the end of 19 and causes this division, breaking up of this ancient church, God's kingdom at that time, Israel. All that division does just brings destruction. We maybe see it in our relationships. We maybe see it in our marriages at times, and we need to pull back from divisiveness, because all it's going to do is it's just going to destroy the marriage. We have to step forward and not back so that we can heal whatever divisions are going on. But lastly, we see this refreshing, it's like a waterfall, this refreshing preservation of wisdom. Sheba is on the run. Remember, he's the rebel. And he heads north to escape David's men, and he goes to the city of Abel Beth Makkah, which is actually an ancient city. Don't know if it's there now, but I know that as I read that it borders Lebanon, so it's northern Israel. He's trying to get offside because he knows he's being chased by David's men. And so General Joab, he's pursuing Sheba to sort him out. And he knows he's in this ancient Israel city of Abel. And so he surrounds the city with his army. He builds a siege ramp, we read in verse 15. And he's about to destroy the city completely, where Abel is camped out, hiding from David's men. And then into this, what happens? A wise woman steps up. And she wants to speak to General Joab, who's, all the effort building a siege ramp. If you've ever seen Mossad or any of those other ancient accounts, this is a big job, and it's not going to happen in an afternoon. So they're putting all this effort into getting ready to destroy the city. And she says, you're trying to destroy a city that is a mother to Israel. Apparently this city had a reputation for wisdom and for peaceable conversation that would bring Israel back from the brink in its past. And so this wise woman, she brings about perspective in the middle of all of this divisive action. She says, hold on. And she brings about this clarity. She brings about this wisdom. Joab, obviously still fixated on what he's going to do as he leads his men, he explains to her the situation in verse 20. He wants to capture Sheba, and as a hardened military man, he reckons the only way he can do that is to destroy the city. And the woman listens. And then the city is saved from destruction because of a rather interesting deal. Do you see it in verse 21? I tell you what, says the woman, we'll chuck Sheba's head over the wall, and then we're square. Who says that the Bible is just nice and flowery and full of romance or whatever? It isn't, is it? It's full of truth and what we're like as well as who God is. So they're going to throw Sheba's head over the wall, and that resolves the problem, as we see in verse 22. Her city is saved. This woman's city is saved. There's no destruction. There's no unnecessary loss. All because one person chose wisdom over fallout. And that, friends, is what Mullock Mean Baptist Church needs. It needs people who are brimming over with the wisdom of God, with the wisdom of the Spirit, as to how they conduct themselves, as to how they respond to divisiveness and to trouble in the church. We need wisdom, specifically God's wisdom, which is the only wisdom worth having. We need wise, Spirit-filled people. We need people who listen before speaking. We need people who are careful not to be reactionary when something negative is happening. We need people who strive for peace without sacrificing truth. After all, look at Jesus. Jesus is not only our perfect King, he is the personification of God's wisdom itself. And we have access to that wisdom through his Spirit. And through his Spirit, then, he forms a people who can reflect his wisdom when it comes to the decisions they're making in life, when it comes to their ability to discern between truth and lies and slander and gossip that sadly can go on in the church. They're the ones who want to know, yeah, okay, but what's the truth? What's the truth of the situation? So, church, with all the challenges that we face, can I encourage you, as well as me, to speak with wisdom? As a peacemaker, not a divider, to speak truth, but to do it with wisdom and grace. And even it may mean that you have to step into conflict at times when you know somebody's being attacked who isn't even in the room, but their name is being mentioned in a most derogatory manner, which is evil, is wrong, and yet it can happen in the church. But are you willing to bring yourself into that situation as a peacemaker with wisdom and grace, and even then to step into the conflicts where you see them and when you feel it's necessary, and instead of taking sides and instead of strengthening factions, we're aiming all the time for restoration. We're not aiming for destruction. If we just pander to the sinful nature within all of us, we're aiming for God's wisdom so that we avoid our self-destruction. You know, I'll tell you this much. One wise believer can change the direction of an entire church community, and I am testimony to that. And I was not the person who said something wise. But I've seen it happen over the years. One dear lady down in the Middleton Church in Cork, again and again, exercised wisdom in the face of division, in the face of difficulty in the life of the church. One wise believer can change the direction of an entire church. So in conclusion this morning, As chapter 20 closes, and we've got, I think, 2 more sermons to do to finish 2 Samuel, David's administration is listed again, okay, verses 23 to 25. We just read there. We see that General Joab was over all of Israel's entire army. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. Adoniram was in charge of forced labor. Jehoshaphat was son of Ahilud, was the recorder. Sheva was secretary. Zadok and Abiathar were the priests. And Ira, the Jairite, was David's priest. In other words, what you're reading there is David's administration is now preserved. There is a degree of order. Order is restored. But the kingdom, as we come out now at the end of chapter 20, the kingdom of David still feels fragile because of human nature. David is a good king, but he's not a perfect king. His people tend to divide, his victories don't last, and all of this is meant to point us forward to the glory and the wonder of us today knowing the perfect king, Christ the King. Because David's people tended to divide, and his victories never really lasted. And all of this is meant to point us forward to Jesus. David, we know, was overwhelmed by grief, as we read in chapter 19. But Jesus remained faithful in his suffering and grief. David's kingdom was divided, but Jesus creates unity out of division. David struggled with sin and weakness, but Jesus reigns in righteousness, and only he can change the hearts of people. So what does this mean for us as Mullockmean Baptist Church today? It means that we must not let personal struggles pull us away from our calling. In other words, emotions that take us over very easily. And we must fight for unity, not only within the church, but within our relationships, within our homes. We must fight at all costs to preserve our unity in Christ. And we must confront division before it grows. We must become people of wisdom then, and of peace. Because, you know, friends, the church is not just some kind of administrative organization. It is the body of Jesus Christ. It is a people shaped by a perfect King. And only when we reflect him in our lives, unity becomes possible, peace is achieved, and the world sees something different. So let me ask you, friend, in this church, are you contributing to our unity, or is your moaning quietly feeding division? Are you walking in humility or seeking recognition? Are you acting with wisdom or reacting with fallen human emotion? And most importantly, are you truly submitted to the King who brings lasting peace? Because only Jesus can do what David could not do. Only he will miraculously keep a people like us together as we serve him. Closing passage. It's always good to apply the new to the old. We're New Testament people, and this is what we read. God's purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of all the divisions. Specifically then it was the Greeks and the Jews, but it can be any division. So out of division, God is creating one new humanity, thus making peace. And in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. Maybe be cognizant of any hostility in this church, and prayerfully, with God's wisdom, know how to respond. Amen.